forward. So we are thrilled to run this program for another year. The MPP Alumni Panel of Multi-Sector Career Pathways. As always, such an interesting range of alum coming from all different backgrounds doing very different work. So what we're going to do is I'm going to ask each of them, and I'm just going to go to around my screen. I'm just going to ask each of them to introduce themselves, a little bit about their background, their current work, and then we will open up to questions. And Will, you were first to log in today, so I'm going to start right with you.
Hey all, I'm Will Dennison. I got my MPP in 2019, and from GW was recruited into Deloitte. So I've spent the last 5 years working as a health policy consultant. And so what that means for me is I spend most of my time working on Medicare projects at the federal level and Medicaid projects at the state level, but I've also worked in other areas of health and human services. So excited to meet the rest of the panelists.
Fantastic. Okay, Aylin, we're going to go with you next.
Of course. Well, thank you very much for having me. My name is Aylin. I'm based in Spain, in Barcelona, and I'm an MPP from 2021. That means that I did the MPP during the pandemic with Professor Rigby. I'm so happy to see you here. And after the master, well, I did my concentration in social policy. So when I finished the master's, I joined the World Bank first as a social protection and jobs consultant, working for the ICA region, Europe and Central Asia. And 2 years ago, I changed department, and now I work for the Women, Business and the Law project. We produce an index, so we do a lot of data work, and we combine data with legal and policy analysis, particularly on gender issues, and we measure legal discrimination around the globe. So in a nutshell, that's pretty much what I'm doing so far.
Fantastic. We're going to move over to Laura.
Thanks, Denise. Hi, everyone. Laura Brennan. I use she, her pronouns. It's great to be here today. I graduated with my MPP in 2022, so not that long ago. I have spent the last 4 years working for nonprofits, doing mainly federal advocacy, but also doing some state advocacy. I just started a new role 2 months ago, but I'm working at the National Healthcare for the Homeless Council, doing healthcare policy at the federal level. As a national organization, membership organization for healthcare for the homeless programs, which are HRSA-funded health centers that provide no or low-cost healthcare services to individuals experiencing homelessness. And so our advocacy work is mainly around harm reduction and Medicaid. But I spent the 4 years before that in the LGBTQ space. So I worked for a national LGBTQ nonprofit doing child welfare policy, both at the state and federal level, but a lot of federal advocacy, both with HHS, including like ACF and the Children's Bureau, but then also working on, we had one federal bill that we worked heavily on. And so that's what's been my last 4 years. And then before coming to Trachtenberg, I did 2 years in Peace Corps, and I was in Ecuador. So I kind of thought that I would go into that international sector, but after being at GW, I got my nonprofit management certificate, and then have just stuck in this kind of federal space since then. But it's great to be here.
I think there's some going to be good questions about that, because that often comes up from people who kind of balance trying to figure out international development versus domestic. So fantastic. Yelena.
Hi, everyone. So good to be here. Also great to see Professor Rigby and Denise again. I think I graduated a little earlier than others so far, nearly a decade ago, but currently work in the federal government as a senior advisor focusing on gender-based violence issues, and I'm technically on detail or kind of temporary assignment, but my permanent position is over at Department of Health and Human Services, where I'm a senior advisor in our legislative affairs office. Before this, spent about 5 years over in the Senate, doing both health policy and kind of with a focus on women's health, gender-based violence, and truly an assortment of other healthcare issues. and also worked on oversight issues over Senate side. Have also previously worked in the Massachusetts State Legislature on behavioral health policy, did a stint House side, and before that actually did 2 years of AmeriCorps as kind of the domestic counterpart to Peace Corps, and really used my TSPA degree to kind of pivot from the direct service side over to the policy side. So I don't know if others are thinking about creative ways to use this time at TSPA, but it was definitely very helpful for me in helping pivot my career. And so happy to kind of be here and talk with you all and provide any perspective or thoughts for anyone who's interested in any of those various pieces.
Fantastic. And it's funny, Elena, you're like, oh, it feels so long ago. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I've been here that long. I feel like it was just yesterday you were in our program. So it's amazing to see what you've been doing since graduation. Grant, you are up next.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be, I guess, back. I'm Grant Holyoke. I'm a Foreign Service Officer at the U.S. State Department. Prior to this, I guess when I was doing my my time at GW, which I graduated in 2018, I was preparing for a career at the Government Accountability Office. And that was during what we'll now refer to as the first Trump administration, when there was not very much hiring into the Foreign Service. So I was preparing for, I guess, Plan B. Just a little bit of time into my time at the GAO, I joined the State Department. So I guess I could speak to both of those. But I'm finishing up my second tour at the State Department right now. My first tour, I was a consular officer at U.S. Embassy Beijing in the People's Republic of China. Right now, I am a human rights officer at our U.S. Embassy in San Salvador, from where I'm calling you today. It's great to be here. Looking forward to talking with all of you.
This is something I love about our program, right? And we're able to do this virtually. We have 2 people internationally here today, so this is fantastic. And from right here in our area, Simone, you're up next.
Hey everyone, can you all hear me? Fabulous. Okay. My name is Simone Hall. I graduated from Trachtenberg back in spring of 2020. I currently work for DC Public Schools as a strategic school budgeting specialist. So kind of working on what I like to think of like the implementation side of education policy. Before I started at DC Public Schools, I was in like the advocacy space. So I've shifted from kind of advocacy to administration and implementation. That's what I've kind of been working on the last 5 years. I think I started in education policy during my second year at Trachtenberg. So yeah, happy to be here.
Fantastic. So this is an opportunity for all of you. Again, I could ask questions, but I would rather we have, over 20 people participants here. So I'd rather open this up for questions that you might have of the panelists. We'll just put in there that Trachtenberg was a pivot for him, but he was for grad school. He worked as a paralegal and ran away from law school. I often hear that. So if someone wants to raise their hand, type in a question. This is an opportunity for you to ask any and all. I'm going to ask a question. I'm going to ask a question that actually just came up recently in some advising, and then I'm going to go to the one that someone just typed in because I really want a lot of people to hear this that I get. When you were in your early 20s and just starting out professionally, did you have a sense of the impact that you were going to have? And what advice would you give yourself when you were early in your career, if you were an MPP student early in your career, about how to be patient to what's going to happen as you build your career? So a lot of students come into our program and they become like, I want to do it all now. I want to make a difference now. And when you're in your early career, so any advice that you would have for students in that situation?
Are you talking about me, Denise? I feel like we had that conversation.
I don't know. I don't remember. Did we, Bill? Why don't you say? I would love
And
to
still
hear.
have that conversation.
Yeah, I would love to hear.
I don't know that I have like any sage wisdom, but I think it's really important to remember that like life is a marathon and not a sprint. Everyone is going to be on their own timelines. I think living and working in a place like DC can make maintaining that perspective challenging, right? Like I'm now in my 30s, not necessarily in the early part of my career, but I still struggle with that. Like, my colleagues, like, well, this person's, getting more opportunities than me. Like, this person's got this great appointment at whatever agency. And I think it's just really important to remember that life is a marathon, and particularly as I've gotten a little bit older, I realize how much time goes by faster. And I think, even though the world's a little crazy right now, I'm trying to be centered and do good in what you're doing, and just know that things will work out when they work out at the right time.
That's great. And I would love to hear others' advice, as well as tying into the question that did come into the chat is, did you know that this specific policy area is what you wanted to work on? And kind of thinking about, how did you figure out what the policy areas, and not everybody chooses a specific policy area, but for any of you that wants to add to that with this question about when you're early in your career, I would love some advice for people.
I can go with that. And also somehow answering your previous question, Denise. So when I started my professional career, I knew that I wanted to have an impact, right? Like a positive impact on society or more generally, but I didn't know how. So it was a kind of weird, right? To discover what was my path. And I wasn't sure about the policy area, but I knew it was something related to law, legislation, but international development area. So law and international development area. So I thought maybe I was in Spain back then, and I'm currently in Spain. I thought, okay, so maybe something related to the European Union. But then I started talking with people, and I noticed that when I had conversations with them, that conversations were interesting. Those conversations were interesting, but it wasn't what I exactly wanted. So I keep talking and trying to find what was that incentivized me. And that's how I knew about the microfinance concept and financial inclusion concept. So I started digging through that area. And I knew that a way of having a positive impact could be through social policies, right? So it was weird because it is like you feel something, right? And you have to be like self-aware of how you feel when you talk with people about certain conversation, how your body reacts when you imagine yourself doing this or that. So it's a way, I would say, it's a discovery, right? And I think you have to be very aware and try to look for that. So it's not an easy decision, or at least in my case, but somehow I kind of knew. It wasn't as specific, but I knew I have to be patient and keep looking for that and keep searching and talking with people.
I'm happy to jump in next too. And I'll try to, I think, answer the assortment of questions, but if I forget something, let me know. So I will say that when I was kind of early in my career, like when I was an undergrad, I wanted to be a psychologist. And by the time I left undergrad, I no longer wanted to be a psychologist. I was much more kind of macro policy change driven, and thus was able to kind of use an MPP as a launching point for that. So I think kind of a piece of practical advice would be to kind of take advantage of the opportunity of being in school, candidly. I think I forgot to mention that I started an advocacy world at TSPA and immediately post TSPA. So being able to kind of, get my foot in the door that way, and then, leverage that for future opportunities. And then in terms of kind of wanting to do all the things all at once, very much get that. Candidly, still feel that way in my mid-30s, wanting to have more of an impact on the world, particularly, at this moment, but in general. So would, I guess, both encourage, I think what you guys just heard about wanting to do something that feels meaningful to you, and if something doesn't, do not feel like you need to do that because you think it is something you should do, but also encourage some flexibility. Like I've gone back and forth between Massachusetts and realized that wasn't the right fit, came back. was doing good government policies for I think a solid 2 years, which I did find very meaningful, but was a little different from what I'd done before, and then went back to gender-based violence and health policy work. So would encourage some flexibility around, the opportunities you're willing to take on, and kind of leveraging what you have available while also being true to yourself and what you're doing, and not just doing things because they're there, you feel like you should, which again, I know is a difficult balance, but I think everyone here is very well positioned to try to do all of that exploration.
And I will add on to that. I will say, as far as wanting to do all of the things, I can agree with Elena's sentiment of wanting to do all of the things. Still now, postgraduate school, but I will say one thing that's important is to celebrate and take the time to acknowledge the small incremental wins that you do have. It may not be a big splash or something that's, highly advertised, but it is important to take the time and acknowledge that you are doing good work and you are making impact in whatever policy space that you're in. And even if it might not feel big, it's still important to kind of recognize what you're doing and reground yourself. Another thing I was going to say regarding my path, like I mentioned, I'm in education policy. Didn't think I was going to end up here, but I think the universe just had an interesting way of placing me here. And another piece that I want to kind of tack on in that same vein is another thing that keeps me grounded is because I'm in education, I make sure to spend some time going to schools and visiting students, because I think in policy, you are several rungs kind of away from the people that are being impacted by the work that you're doing. So I think it's important to reground yourself. So if you're in housing, I don't know, visiting folks who are benefiting from perhaps like the affordable housing that you are maybe involved in related to. So essentially just meeting face to face, interacting with the folks that you are hoping to help. I think that also is very helpful in helping you to remember why you're here and who you're doing it for.
And I'll add on,
I think it's okay. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just saying, not to belabor, I think like +1 to what everyone has said. I will say, like, I mean, I never thought I would be doing LGBTQ child welfare policy. It's very niche, it's very specific, like didn't ever see that happening. One of the things that I find is really helpful and has been helpful as I transition into a new role is the people I'm working with, like finding people who, one, can be really good mentors and also colleagues who you really align with. I think that helps your professional and personal development, that can make you a better advocate and professional to create the impact that you want to create. And that's made a huge difference as I've picked roles. And to touch on Sawyer's question in the chat, I think when you're looking for something, whether it's LGBTQ or whatever that area you want to look at, I think reviewing what they're putting out on their website, what policy briefs they're putting out, checking out their social media, I think you get a good feel when you just like monitor organizations that are in that field and doing the work, and you can get a sense of what they stand for and what specific areas they're working on. Happy to touch more on the LGBTQ stuff in the breakout room if that feels useful. And then, yeah, I think just like Simone was saying, finding ways to connect with folks on the ground. So like the nonprofit I work at right now, a lot specific time during the week for us to get involved in local organizations. And that's been really nice for me. So I've been able to work and touch with homeless shelters and clinics. I live in Austin, Texas. So here. And so just finding that time, like finding an organization that aligns with those values and create space for you to do what feels like impactful and also do the policy advocacy side if that's what you want to be doing.
Since we're on Sawyer's question, I just wanted to jump in a little piece about figuring out what companies or what offices to work for. My favorite piece of career advice that I got from anybody about how to decide where to work was to kind of leverage the opportunities, whether they be like internships or whatever, to spend time with people that work in the relevant office or in the company or in the sector. That was something that this is when I was an undergraduate, I was studying sociology, and my department head told me, here's the thing, Grant, if you think that you want to be a sociology professor, hang around a sociology department. Most sociology departments have the same cast of characters approximately, and they care about generally the same things. If that's your people, and if you find your people there, then that's a signal that you found the right people and that you found the right career. I did an internship at the State Department during the end of my undergraduate time, and I found my people. And I can speak to the fact that they, people vary, but Foreign Service officers are Foreign Service officers wherever they are. And anyway, that I found that to be a good litmus test. Are these the kind of people? One, is it the work that I'm interested in, but also is this the kind of person that I want to go to lunch with every day, and also the kind of person that I want to become through osmosis over the course of my life.
Just so quickly, I can add one thing. I would just say, do all the coffees would I guess be my recommendation there. I mean, truly for all of this, but it feels weird. I still sometimes find that it feels weird, but it is truly the most, especially in a public policy field, thing you can do of reaching out to someone and asking to grab coffee, where coffee can be anything from like a Zoom to a phone call to literally sitting down with coffee. But that is truly the best way to find out some of this information and see who you vibe with, what works for you, and also to really learn about opportunities candidly as well.
Fantastic.
And be open to the unexpected, right? If you had told me 5.5 years ago when I was graduating that I was going to be doing Medicare and Medicaid policy, I would have laughed at you. I don't even think I would have really knew what it was. Probably like would have, if I could go back in time, I would have taken different electives, right? But I fell into this space because the colleagues I met kept me going.
Love it. Before we move to the two people have their hands raised, I just want to see if there anybody else want to add to Sawyer's question. Anybody else insights around human rights, especially LGBTQ plus people? Do you have advice for someone breaking into that field and narrow down specific companies? Is there anything else? I know Grant, you had said that you would be happy to talk to someone individually, and that is there anything else anyone wants to add to that question at this point? Okay, I just want to make sure. And it looks like there's been some offers for some individuals, so definitely, Sawyer, feel free for the breakout groups to go in and have those further conversations. Kari, I'm going to go with you next, and then it'll be Madeline.
Hello, everyone. My name is Carrie Harper. I am a second-year MPP student, and my concentration is in social policy, specifically looking at gender and race. So it's really great to meet with you all, and I want to thank all of you for taking your time out of your day and coming to speak with us. My question is more directed towards those who are working in the gender violence, or just even talking about gender in terms of policy. I guess it's kind of a two-pronged question. The first is, what does your policy work actually look like working in the gender space? And then also, what does policy advocacy mean to you, or like, what does that entail with your job? Because I'm in a policy class right now with Professor Rigby, and I just want to hear more about what that looks like, tying in gender, race, sexuality. I would love to hear your insight on those things.
I can start if that is helpful. And again, also happy to get more detail in a breakout room if that is useful. Let me, I guess, start with the second half of like what the day-to-day, sorry, this might be the first half, but like what the day-to-day looks like is actually very similar to what I have found policy work in general looks like, which is so when you're in advocacy, right, you're hoping to elevate issues to policymakers to try to further change that will help this particular group. So you're talking to folks on the ground about their experiences and then working to translate that into actionable policy items that you can then kind of create a compelling message for why lawmakers and policymakers should do that. And then to the reverse, right, you're communicating what policies are and their impact, either to impacted groups for their resources, but also just communicate what impact you have had. And then kind of on the policymaking side, you're kind of one step removed from that, where a lot of what you're doing is having those conversations with stakeholders to hear what those experiences are and trying to translate that into policy. And then kind of on the reverse, right, translate what you have accomplished back so that you're able to keep making good changes, or avoiding bad policy change too is also a factor. So I'd say that is kind of the day-to-day of that, where my passion and focus has frequently been on the gender side of things. And so that is, I think the main issue there is kind of there's particular groups and stakeholders, and also being mindful to maintain that intersectional lens, which it sounds like you were already focused on that very intersectional lens of race, gender, but also other nexes of marginalization. Oftentimes, you know, if you're serving the most marginalized, you're serving everybody, but the way that different policymakers approach different communities can be very different. And so how are you working to try to, I know my approach is always, how can I do the most good and not do harm? So, you know, you kind of have to keep that guiding principle in mind, I think, because sometimes policy does require compromise, and seeing what compromises make sense versus what compromises don't. So I know it's a very high level answer, but hopefully it kind of helps get at both of your questions.
No,
Anyone
yeah,
else?
that was wonderful. Thank you.
I have a piece that I could add about policy advocacy and what that can look like. As a human rights officer, gender is one of the many things that we think about and that I work on, which that was specifically covered before. But I want to talk. It's kind of a mix between the question that Denise asked and this one about what policy advocacy can look like, especially when, like me, relatively new to the career, am pretty far down on the ladder where not too many people are at least ostensibly asking my opinion about things. I've actually found that being at this stage in my career, at this moment in the State Department hierarchy, at least, which is very hierarchical, most of my input, most of my advocacy, there's a good amount that is with my interlocutors in the host country and in the host government that I do. But a lot of the most important work that I do is kind of internal diplomacy, and it's being the person who makes sure that an important issue for me and for the American people gets talked about in just about every meeting. So while to many it might seem like a thankless, or I guess a job that fits very low on the priority ladder, I'm asked, for example, to draft agendas for meetings that we're going to have. We have a lot of meetings in the to talk about our policy within the embassy and within the department. And if I hold the pen on drafting an agenda, I get to be the person to say, I also think that we should talk about, in this instance, gender-based violence, or I think that we also need to make sure that we don't forget to raise the importance of Afro descendants here in El Salvador, a group that's often marginalized and forgotten. So it's an interesting opportunity, even beginning in your career, to be the person to put something on paper. And to be honest, I guess just functionally, I've found that people are much more interested in adding to a paper that already exists than going through the confrontation of saying that I actually don't like that on the agenda and I want to take it away. Usually, if you put it on paper, it makes it into the meeting. And then afterwards, we also, at least in my part of my career, often taking notes. And I often, when I come away from a meeting, get the first run at being the person to say, here were the important bullets that came out of a meeting, and here's what I think. I get to frame it for anybody who wasn't in the meeting as for what was genuine and important that came out of it. The entry level in any organization that holds the pen has inherently an advocacy opportunity.
I'll add just on the policy advocacy piece. For me at the federal level, I view it really as like my role is storytelling and data. Like, to me, that is policy and advocacy. So I'm bringing the stories. So I work specifically on non-discrimination policy. So like non-discrimination on the basis of sex, defining that to include sexual orientation and gender identity. But bringing stories of folks who had experienced that discrimination, making sure those stories were intersectional and that they reflected a large swath of the country, including places that I think like we don't always think about, like rural counties and red areas that sometimes get left behind. So bringing those stories to lawmakers and bringing whatever data, which is very limited, whatever data I could find with it to like showcase what was happening. And then I think just making sure, like on that do no harm, is making sure that as you're doing that storytelling, that you're not re-traumatizing anyone. A lot of times these experiences of individuals are really hard. And so trying to navigate like, oh, this individual's lived experience in child welfare, like they went through this and they want to be able to tell their story, but how do we do that in a way that is safe for them and that helps influence policy? I think part of that is finding ways when there are wins as well. And so like building the connections that if something good happens, if something good gets passed, we can, bring them to the bill signing, or we can bring them to like every year the White House, well, the Biden administration does like a big LGBTQ day. Like, how do we get them invited to that, and like relifting and providing something to them? And so that's kind of how I view that policy and advocacy work, really just storytelling and data, and just being an amplifier for the voices of those like most impacted.
Thank you all so much. Oh, I was just saying thank you.
Great. We'll take Madeline, and then we had a question in the chat, and then Tasha.
Okay, hi. I'm a first-year MPP student, and my question is also surrounding gender-based violence and women's issues. So Elena, I was just kind of wondering, from your perspective, like how does your work with gender-based violence span a lot of different policy fields? Because I saw you have experience in like health, education, and labor and stuff like that. Like how do you dip into those policy fields to approach gender-based violence? And then kind of for, I'm going to say your name wrong, so I'm so sorry, Alan Ferrari. I know yours is maybe more like very quantitative research based, but do you also find yourself in an advocacy role often?
I'm happy to answer that. I would say just happy to go more in depth in the breakout room, so I might keep it high level here in the interest of time. But so because gender-based violence is intersectional across kind of the wide array of issue areas, right? So if folks want some fun reading, there is a U.S. National Plan to End Gender-Based Violence, which has 5 pillars, and that covers everything from economic security to disaster preparedness and response to the justice system. Obviously, there's health aspects as well, but it is across the federal government, right? There is going to be a gender-based violence aspect to it. You cannot be an expert in everything. So I think, especially when you're kind of more on the policy making or implementation side, there is a lot of reliance on external stakeholders and experts, and kind of funneling that information in, but also being able to, and kind of capable to be able to analyze like where different people are coming from, where their expertise, where their, potential perspectives might be coming from, and then how do you make that actionable? And I think that kind of comes over time and building networks and finding trusted partners. But it is a lot of working across those different spaces. I have found that within kind of policymaking and advocacy, the skills are very similar across buckets. And so it is very translatable. Like I've done everything from ethics to gender-based violence to Medicaid and Medicare, which I know others have mentioned. So you can learn the details of a policy issue very quickly, as long as you're able to both kind of do your homework, but also be willing to talk with people and admit where you may not know the answer, right? You should not always just assume you know, like certainly follow your instincts, and particularly when you get in depth on a particular issue area, I think that can help guide you, but very much be willing to kind of collaborate and work with partners and uplift SMEs in those particular subject matters. Because, there are people in the federal government who have been working on a very specific issue for decades, and they will always know that research, that GBV program, whatever, better than me. And so my job is kind of how can I help empower and enable and amplify and improve that work, and rely on the voices of survivors and their experiences, rather than kind of top down telling people what to do, if that makes sense.
Anyone else adding? Oh, Palin. Okay.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. No, just to answer your question, we do a lot of advocacy work. At Women, Business and Law, we are a data-driven team. So basically what we do is we collect data on legislation and policies from 190 countries, right? So that's a big part of our work, collecting data. And the purpose of collecting data is to help governments, right, to identify their gaps, their legal gaps. So once we have all the data and we know the story, as Laura was saying, our next job is to engage with the governments, with policymakers, and assist them to reform their legislation, to create policies, to implement that law and to correct, right, the gap, or to bridge the gap. And that implies a lot of advocacy. The way we try to communicate is, of course, there's an ethical perspective, but also an economic perspective, right? So gender equality makes economic sense. And that's a strong message, and that's something governments want to hear, right? Because especially in developing countries, there is a problem regarding the lack of financial resources or human capital to make these reforms happen, right? So some countries will say, okay, but I can't do what you suggest, right? And it's our job to provide technical assistance, for example. Or they believe that that's not a priority and they have other pressing issues to solve first. And that's why, or when, we have to chime in and explain why this is important, why this should be a priority. And not just because we think it is, but to show, right, with data, why this is a global priority and why this is important for your government at national and at local level too. So yeah, I would say in our team or in our work, we have a strong data job, or that's a big part of our job, but doing advocacy, it's what makes sense for us, right? Or the purpose of what we do. And the main goal is to improve legislation, improve policies, and help governments to reach gender legal equality. So yeah.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you both.
Tasha, I'm going to go to you next, and that might be our last question, depending on how much time. Somebody did ask a question. Would you recommend any courses, specifically quantitative, which you found super helpful in your professional endeavors? Anyone?
I will say this was not me personally, but I think maybe one potential career path. I don't know if we have folks represented here. Is I know a bunch of people who from their MPP went to do more of the quantitative, like I'm going to be at OMB, valuing rules at OIRA, going to be at GAO doing audits and things there. So I'd say if you are interested in kind of that more like, I want to do analysis after my MPP, I think CBA is very useful. The statistics courses, like econ, the hard skills you would be using, like budgeting. Again, I did not take that path, but from folks I know who did from the MPP program, I think those they found very useful because they were very, like the literal skills they were learning in class they were using.
I would also just say, at least in the federal government, in my experience so far, people who are AI literate stand out and remain the exception rather than the norm. To anything you can do to increase your familiarity with and also your ability to cheerlead and advocate for the use of AI is very welcome.
And I would add econometric is very important to understand. I mean, if you're going to do analysis, like Elena was saying, you need to understand that, like, the cause and effect, or if the policy really makes an impact and how, or at least to be able to read a paper and understand the formula or what they're saying, right? Like understand what is a regression. So I would say econometrics, statistics, yeah, at least in my case, have been very helpful.
Great. I'm going to actually, I want to go to Tasha in case anybody has anything else that they want to add about coursework. And what I'm also going to do is I'm just mentioning to what Will just said, just as a reminder to students, we have our first course that's happening this spring on AI and public policy. It's going to be taught with an alum, Margaret Smith, who's amazing, was on a panel I did last year on the role of AI in public service. So I'm just going to put this in here as a reminder to all of you. And Tasha, you are on.
Hi, thank you all for being here. My name is Tosha. I'm a first year MPP student. I'm curious if any of you have had an experience where you started a job and it quickly became clear that it was not a good fit, whether it's the subject area, the actual job responsibilities, or the work environment? I'm curious how you react and respond to that, and what advice you have for moving forward from that in a professional way.
I can start. I only have one example. So the place I worked at for 4 years doing LGBTQ policy, I started right before I started my MPP, and I started as an intern. It was unpaid, so I worked a semester unpaid doing that. And I was doing it 32 hours a week. It was a lot. And I was in grad school. I was like, I could really use some extra money. I took a paid internship somewhere and realized it was not for me. I was there for a month. I did not like it. It was not I think the issue area was not something I felt the most passionate about. The work, the day-to-day work I was doing just wasn't as like advocacy focused I was hoping for. And I ended up quitting that internship and going back to my unpaid one, but I was able to get them to pay me not much. And then they brought me on full time after that, but I was able to go back to where I was originally because that's where my heart was, that's where my passion was. And so I would say it's really tough to quit, but I'm so glad that I did. Like, it was an uncomfortable conversation to accept something. I felt like I owed them. I felt like I made a commitment, but at the same time, I knew that that wasn't where my heart was, and I wasn't going to be as good of an employee as I could be. And it also just wasn't aligning with my own career goals, which is just as important. So while it was uncomfortable, I will say I'm really glad I made that decision, and that at the end of the day, you have to follow like your heart and your passion, because I think so much of the work in this space is really like being passionate about it, especially when there are hard times, or like when you're not passing things, when you're just only doing defensive work, or you're seeing like terrible bills get passed. Like, what I think brings you through is the people you work with and your passion for it. And so if that's not there and you're doing a job you don't like, it's really tough. So that's my only experience with it, but welcome other insights.
Any other questions people want to share? Because if not, what I would love to do is open up the breakout rooms. But any last thoughts from our panelists as a group? So I just want to thank you all. I love the diversity of experience, from local government to international policy, to advocacy. I always appreciate these programs in terms of just helping students understand the field in a real pragmatic way. So I just really want to thank you all. We love supporting our students and having our alumni come back. And I always love seeing everything that you all are doing. So at this point,